me pull up my very first slide. Hopefully that's visible. I added a subtitle. So my title is Algebra and Civil Rights, and I added the subtitle, An Introduction to Bob Moses, because I wanted to amplify his profile in this discussion, because what a lot of people know about Bob Moses is limited to his activities in Mississippi in the 1960s, and they don't realize the activities he's done since then and continues to do because he is still alive. But before I talk about Mr. Moses, I would like to give a brief introduction to myself for people who don't know. I got my PhD in the University of Pittsburgh History and Philosophy of Science department, and I wrote a thesis on algebraic reasoning and representation in 17th century mathematics, Fermat's treatise on quadrature. And the project of the thesis was this. At the beginning of the 17th century, before analytic geometry and algebra is incorporated into geometry, people are struggling piecemeal with problems. And by people, we mean René Descartes, the founder of the Cartesian coordinate system. And throughout the 1640s and 1650s, people like other people get involved in the project. And by the end of the century, the calculus has been invented. So the question becomes, what causal role did algebraic reasoning and representation play in 17th century mathematics? So that's where I started as a scholar, was in the historical dimensions of algebraic reasoning and representation. I have been a member of the Association for the Philosophy of Mathematical Practice from to the 21st century. The association is committed to understanding mathematics as something that people do, as a collection of practices, not some abstract knowledge that's disconnected from everyday experience, not some set of objects that are in some other realm that we have only limited access to. Because of my relationships with the APT, I was invited to give a talk by the Indian National Science Foundation in 2015 at a conference called Cultures of Mathematics. And it was in 2015 that I really got involved in looking at algebra in the American Academy. And the embarrassing thing about this talk was that I identified the problem and I criticized many solutions, but I didn't yet know about Bob Moses and the Algebra Project until I was at another conference talking about what I had talked about in India. Somebody said to me, "Oh yeah, I know all about that, what Bob Moses and the Algebra Project. What you're telling me is already widely known." So it was a lesson in humility to then discover the missing piece from my talk on algebra in the American Academy was the actual solutions that Moses had developed. I'm also a member of the International Association for Science and Cultural Diversity ever since that conference as well. And the goals of this organization are to understand science, something that people around the world do. It's not just something that Europeans invented and exported to the rest of the world. Science is a way of looking at the world, and it's something people do all over. And so we have historical and philosophical conferences that look at science as something, again, something that people do and a variety of people do. But let's switch now to introduce you to Bob Moses. Now, this is both a brief introduction to Bob Moses and the outline of my talk. Bob Moses is remembered first and foremost as a legendary civil rights activist. I call him a reluctant legend for reasons that we will talk about later. He is also a teacher, a father, and a MacArthur Fellow. He is the founder of Algebra Project Incorporated, and I argue is a philosopher of mathematics whose philosophy of mathematics influences his identity as a movement organizer. So where did Bob Moses come from? Robert Paris Moses was born in Harlem in 1935. He went to Stuyvesant High School, a selective public high school in Manhattan in 1952, is where he graduated. And he went to Hamilton College for his BA in 1956. And people often assume he studied math, but of course he majored in philosophy and then got his master's degree in philosophy from Harvard in 1957, and then got a job teaching math at Horace Mann School in the Bronx. And this idea that someone who has a master's in philosophy could end up teaching math, well, he could teach at Horace Mann because he didn't have the public school credentials to teach math, but he'd been studying mathematical logic as part of his philosophical studies and was very good at math. And so he was qualified to teach in the private school sector, and that's how he got that job. What he was known for is being a grassroots activist. He credits legendary activist Ella Baker with being the person who really inspired and mentored him and helped him to understand that effective social change must include movement from the bottom up. It cannot be driven exclusively as a top-down set of initiatives. You need to involve community members, as well as the outside agitators that Moses and the other members of SNCC were. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Bob Moses, after working with Ella Baker, becomes one of the field secretaries for SNCC, working in the state of Mississippi to help register voters. And COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, brought together multiple organizations to around the idea that every person should have the right to vote. They organized the very famous Freedom Summer, where college students from around the country came down to Mississippi in 1964 to help people register to vote. But of course, that's not all they did. They literally integrated with members of the Mississippi community. They set up freedom schools where they worked on literacy project and educating students. And the students were both children and adults. And sometimes when you look at the actual math of the registration numbers, it's somewhat dismaying how they can, in one county, for example, get 1,500 people to try and register to vote and have only 50 of those 150 applications be accepted in one county. But even though the numbers were grim and the obstacles were high, many people credit Freedom Summer with being a turning point, a change in the tides, a sea change in the way people thought about voting as a federally protected right. See, the problem in Mississippi was that Mississippi wanted to be a state unto itself. They wanted to have their own rules and their own laws and enforce them. And the idea that no, the Constitution guarantees every citizen in the state of Mississippi the right to vote, that was a radical suggestion at the time. So what made the movement successful? If you ask Bob Moses, he tells you what made the movement successful. He said there were certain ingredients that we had that contributed to the success of the SNCC and COFO movement that culminated in Freedom Summer and other initiatives. One of them is the consensus that formed around the idea that every person, one vote. I think they said one man, one vote, but the general idea was for each person, there was to be one vote. And this was what united the community members, the student volunteers, the SNCC organizers, and other activists at the time. Moses also says that in addition to consensus, what they needed was the crawl space. Now, crawl space is a metaphor that he says, a space in which to work. He says that while it's true that, sorry for my neighbors are doing homework, while it's true that the community needs to be involved and we want to have grassroots organization where leadership bubbles up from the community, they also need support from the federal government to create the crawl space. So he credits the Civil Rights Act of 1957 in the formation of a wing of the Justice Department to prosecute violations of that. as creating the space necessary for the organization to operate. Because as people are trying to register to vote and they're countering violent protest and end up in a violent protest to their trying to register to vote and end up in jail, they need lawyers to bail them out and challenge the authorities that were in place that were trying to get trying to stop people from registering to vote through intimidation and violence and other means. There's also another idea that Bob talks about that's part of what made this movement successful. And he says people kind of bristle at this idea of earned insurgency, as if insurgency is something that people have automatically without having to earn it. And so what he means by the earned insurgency when he talks about Freedom Summer is the fact that the volunteers kept back. They would be encounter resistance, violence, but they kept getting up and helping people register to vote, teaching people to read, learning from the people they were teaching ways of life that were not known to them outside to the volunteers before they had come to Mississippi. And this idea of earned insurgency is one that I think we can talk about some more. And I have a reference to where you can hear Moses talking about that. And finally, the other successful ingredient from Moses's perspective was community participation. The participation of sharecroppers like Fannie Mae Hamer is one of the things that gave legitimacy to the movement. It wasn't just people coming from outside and saying, this is what you're going to do. It was people coming from outside and saying, how can we help? And in fact, not everyone in SNCC thought that having college students from across the nation come down to Mississippi to help people to register to vote was a good idea. And yet it was the community members who argued with the SNCC field reps and said, and field secretaries and said, no, let them come. We need this. We need the publicity. We need the promotion. We need their assistance. And so that was another thing that contributed to the success of the movement. But what a lot of people don't know is what happened after the movement. When Bob Moses is 31 years old, he is drafted in the Vietnam War, unsurprisingly, after giving speeches opposing the Vietnam War. And he was a conscientious objector, but over his application for conscientious objector status was overruled. So he and his wife moved to Canada first, to more teachers there, and then he taught math in Tanzania from 1969 to 1976. And it wasn't until President Carter offered amnesty to draft dodgers like Moses to come back into the country that he and his family returned. So he returns to the United States in 1976 with 4 kids and resumed his studies in philosophy of mathematics at Harvard, and his wife goes to medical school. Then in 1982, a confluence of 2 important events happened at the same time. On the one hand, his oldest daughter, was going into 8th grade, and he won a MacArthur grant, the so-called Genius Award, that freed him up from the obligation of having to pursue his doctoral studies so that he could focus exclusively on his daughter's mathematical education. He argued that since there was no algebra for 8th graders at his daughter's school, that what he needed to do was have her do the algebra on her own, on the side, in addition to her schoolwork. And his daughter Maisha said, I think I should take 1 math class as an 8th grader. And if you want me to take algebra as an 8th grader, I should be doing that. So Moses goes to her teacher and says, do you mind if she sits in the corner and I write the homework assignments for her for this 8th grade math class? Because otherwise, all she's doing is review of 7th grade arithmetical skills. And the teacher said, well, no, I can't have another student working with a completely different in my class. Why don't you teach your daughter 8th grade math? I got a couple other students that might be interested. And it was this decision in 1982 on the part of Moses to become his daughter's 8th grade algebra teacher, along with two other students, that began a collaboration between him and his kids' school, the King School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for the next 5 years. And this is the gestation period of the algebra program. You see, Bob Moses knew that if his daughter didn't get Algebra 1 in 8th grade, then she wouldn't be able to complete the college preparatory sequence that left all of her options open at the end of high school, including the option of going into a science, technology, engineering, medicine field, what we now call the STEM fields. Because after Algebra 1 comes geometry, then Algebra 2, then trigonometry and analytic geometry, the very same content I was talking about before from the 17th century, and ultimately courses in the calculus or pre-calculus. And so it was in teaching these middle school students in the 80s on the MacArthur grant that made Mr. Moses focus so much on whether or not quality algebraic education is being offered to students in middle schools in this country at large. Because if he's having to demand it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, what is the situation like in other parts of the country? So in 1990, the Algebra Project, Inc. is incorporated, and this is its logo. And what is it? Well, it's a movement that's grown from a handful of students and one teacher in one school to a nationwide movement of many teachers in many schools today. The focus of the Algebra Project is on middle school education with an emphasis on a transition curriculum that's designed to help people move from arithmetic concepts to algebraic concepts. See, one of the struggles that people have when they try to learn algebra, and this was a struggle that Rene Descartes had in the 17th century, is that solutions to algebraic problems aren't simply answers to integer questions such as how many, as in how many pieces of thumb do I have, how many fingers do I have, but you also need to know which direction and which axis you are on. Is the number positive or negative? And so Moses developed ways of cultivating intuitions in middle school students so that they could begin to see mathematics as something more than arithmetic, as something more than a set of questions designed around the how many question. Because how many is an important mathematical question, but which direction, which axis are we on? Is this north-south or east-west? These are also important mathematical concepts. The philosophy of the Algebra Project is a conditional. If we can teach algebra to middle school students, we should. And their slogan at their home webpage, which is active today, is the Algebra Project uses mathematics literacy as an organizing tool to guarantee quality public school education for all children in the United States of America. In other words, by focusing on this one dimension of education, algebra in middle school, the idea is that they can become an effective tool for organizing improvements in education in fields outside of mathematics. Wait, I'm out of my slides. Here we go. So I also said that Bob Moses was a philosopher of math. When he was at Harvard, he studied with Wilhelm von Orman Quine, Akron, Ohio's own philosopher, who left Akron, Ohio, and studied at Oberlin and then went to Harvard, where he ultimately got his doctorate and became a professor. Quine had a philosophy of science and mathematics that said that what happens in science and mathematics is that ordinary language is transformed into regimented discourse, and that the way we talk when we are talking scientifically and mathematically is a somewhat artificial modification of the way we naturally speak to facilitate communication and to be more precise and clear about what it is exactly that we're talking about. In light of this philosophy of mathematics, part of the philosophy of the Algebra Project is that students have to do language-based exercise so they can learn to speak mathematically. And importantly, these language-based exercises have to start with a shared experience amongst the students so that students can learn to own their own education, and so that some of the mysticism surrounding mathematics, where the teacher knows all the answers and the students are empty vessels waiting to be filled, can be disrupted. That model of education is not part of the Algebra Project. In fact, when Bob Moses was working with some teachers, because sometimes what happens is the superintendent gets excited about the Algebra Project and then brings it to the teachers, and the teachers are like, I don't know what this is, but it's not math, because the students are going on a trip, on a public transportation. They're taking the bus, they're taking the T. They're learning that in addition to counting how many stops the train makes, you also have to keep track of whether your train is inbound or outbound. This is a way of answering the question that we were talking about earlier, which way, and how important that is in addition to answering the question, how many? So this is my words, the last bullet point on this slide. This is how I have been putting it for years, but it certainly can be seen, I think, in the philosophy of mathematics of Quine to a small extent, and to the philosophy of mathematics of Bob Moses to a large extent. When people ask, is mathematics created or is mathematics discovered? This question is based on a false dichotomy, which says that either mathematics is something that we make up as we go along, which doesn't explain its success in the natural sciences and helping to model the world, or they say mathematics is discovered. Mathematics is out there somewhere, and we are mighty explorers on our way to track it. And in my view, and I believe in Moses's view as well, this dichotomy is far too simplistic to talk about what's actually happening in the history of mathematics. So the way I put it is I will say things like wild mathematical relations are domesticated by symbolic systems that are cultivated in response to practical problems. The way that Moses puts this, actually what's interesting is in order to fit it on the slide, I had to take someone else's gloss on the Algebra Project. So the quote is from this book, which is Improving Access to Mathematics, Diversity and Equity in the Mathematics Classroom, because it's a shorter statement that fits on the slide than this book, which is where most of the content for today's talk comes from. This is how does Bob Moses get from the civil rights movement to the Algebra Project. But this is a very concise statement of the 5-step curricular process that characterizes the Algebra Project. Number 1, students need to engage in a physical experience, like going for a trip or playing a game. Then they need to represent in their own words and pictures what they just did. And then learn to translate their own words and pictures into a more structured language, including everyday language or people talk, the way people normally talk to one another, and feature talk, which highlights the mathematical dimensions of the process that the students have just been through. And finally, step 5 comes at the end, only at the end, is the problem translated into conventional mathematical notation. Now, this is a big ask of teachers, because instead of saying, here's the content for the day, come into the classroom, deliver the content, and test the students and see if they got it, the idea is have the students do an activity and break into groups where they talk to one another about what they've just done. Then, once they have produced amongst themselves artifacts representing their experience, then the teacher is on their obligation to find the mathematical commonalities between the different small groups and then call attention to the mathematical features and do the final step of putting those observations into mathematical notation. This is why some teachers, when they're first exposed to the Algebra Project, say, I don't know what this is, but it's not math. But I think it is math. I think this is how mathematics developed historically, and it is also how people learn mathematics. The jump from physical experience to representing things in everyday language, feature language, and ultimately mathematical notation. When we talk about people who are, quote, naturally good at mathematics, what I think we mean when we say that is these are these jumps between steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 quickly and without a lot of teacher support. But those might be the exception rather than the rule. So here's a picture of Bob, his wife Janet, and his daughter Maisha, all grown up. His other children went through the same school when he was teaching, where he was teaching algebra initially, and now two of his four children work with the Algebra Project today. Will this movement succeed? Well, this is an interesting question. We have to ask ourselves, what is the consensus? What is the consensus? Plays the role in the analogy for the right to vote, the right to a quality education that prepares students for the 21st century, where we live in a technologically based culture where intellectual property is king, rather than an industrial society where arithmetic skills are all people need to get by. What's the consensus here? In the 60s, the consensus was one person, one vote. What's the consensus in the Algebra Project? Well, from the people within the project, it's if we can teach middle school students algebra, then we should. But there's might be room for developing more consensus. The next question becomes, where's our crawl space? Okay. One of the challenges in mathematics education today is, like the entire education system, it's administered on a state-by-state basis. Even initiatives like the Common Core initiative are voluntary initiatives that states may choose to adopt or not. And I've got another talk about the Common Core and whether or not it prepares people for STEM careers and whether or not it's strong enough to do the job that it was intended to do. But from Moses's perspective, if it's not a federally guaranteed standard, then there are still going to be states where students are left behind. So in order to create more crawl space, Moses argues that we need to understand the right to a quality public education as a constitutional struggle. In other words, he asks, should access to a quality public education be a federally guaranteed right? And unsurprisingly, the people in the Algebra Project are following the lawsuit in Detroit where the students are suing the state for not having provided a quality education very closely. And as recently as July in the summer of 2020, when someone was asking Moses to reflect upon the civil unrest that led to this very Brownbag, he makes an important distinction between improving opportunity and access in the public education system and investing in assessment and accountability. We have done a lot of investing in assessment and accountability, but less work has been done in improving opportunity and access. So another question we have to ask is, what should our tax dollars fund? So will this movement succeed? On the one hand, when we look at recent research, and this is just an abstract from an essay that was published in Educational Research in June this summer, is school racial ethnic competition associated with content coverage in algebra? The authors of this study claim that in predominantly Black schools, a smaller amount of time is spent on algebra in the middle schools compared to other schools. So you might say that this study is evidence that the Algebra Project still has a long way to go. On the other hand, I would argue that the visibility of the Algebra Project is part of what is motivating people to conduct this kind of research and document the disparities in access to quality education, and specifically algebraic education in the middle school in this country. And that if we can get the same commitment of people to quality mathematical education and quality education in general that we were able to generate around the vote, then we might be able to get the kind of groundswelling of change that the Algebra Project hopes for. Now, in the same way that SNCC was part of the Council of Federated Organizations, the Algebra Project now identifies itself as part of a larger movement called We the People. And at mathliteracyforall.org, you can find out about the We the People movement. And I have two graphical representations. Now, if you look in the upper right corner, the diagram has We the People in the center. One of the offshoots you might recognize from a previous slide is the logo of the Algebra Project. Underneath that is the logo for the Young People's Project. And the Young People's Project is an organization developed independently of the Algebra Project, designed to give young people themselves ownership over their own mathematical education. And in fact, Moses encourages them to market curriculum materials that they develop to help people learn mathematics, whether it's as an after-school activity or a weekend activity. The Young People's Project is very committed to improving access to algebraic education as a youth movement. So what is We the People? I made the analogy that just like SNCC was one of the organizations that contributed to Freedom Summer, the Algebra Project is just one of a network of organizations that's now under the We the People banner. And taking this line from the Constitution highlights the constitutional struggle built into this demand for quality education. So at the Math Literacy for All website, they identified the We the People National Alliance is dedicated to uniting a variety of schools and organizations fighting for equity and excellence in math education across our country. This space is dedicated to sharing member stories and experiences, as well as opportunities related to promoting math literacy as a constitutional right for all students. Now, one of the things that's weird about math, here's the thing that's weird about math. People who can't read, they're not proud of that fact. They don't brag about it. No one goes around saying, oh, well, you know me, I just can't read. And yet people have no difficulty saying, well, you know me, I just can't do math. I struggle with math. Well, why are we so comfortable with being illiterate in mathematics when we would not be comfortable with being literate in reading and writing? There's a large amount of work to be done just on the part of our own attitudes towards mathematics as something we can do, that's something young kids can do, something that people can do if they're given the opportunity and access to develop their mathematical reasoning abilities. Now, the map of the country with the nodes and lines connecting them connect different parts where the Algebra Project has taken hold. So you can see in Baltimore and Chicago and Boston and down in Florida, there's an Algebra Project happening. And the node below Lake Erie, I think the nearest Algebra Project that's currently being undertaken under the official Algebra Project Inc. banner is the Ohio State University Mansfield campus has an Algebra Project that they've started, and you can read about it online. And I think that is what that circle there represents. So to wrap up, I wasn't sure if I would how much audiovisual I would be able to share. So I want to conclude with a slide that contains some selected AV sources, some recommended viewing and listening for people who want to know more. For example, if you want to know more about what Bob Moses was saying in 1964 about Freedom Summer before it happened, you can listen to his speech that he gave at Stanford University in April of 1964. And it's really impressive to listen to it and see that the same demands that were being made in 1964 are relevant today. Demands for adequate housing, ending to police brutality, voter rights for everybody, and quality public education for everyone. Finally, if you want to learn more about Freedom Summer, there is a documentary made by PBS in the 50-year anniversary from 2014 on the American experience. So I recommend that. You can see clips of Moses and other activists who were involved in that summer and what kinds of work people had to do in the voter registration drive. Now, the next link I have here is The Nation's Dirty Secret. This is just a 3-minute and 46-second video, which if we were doing this live, I would totally make everyone watch it. It's Bob Moses' statement from 2013, and it was recorded by the Children's Defense Fund, where the dirty secret is that even though students are passing the tests needed to get into college, alarming percentages of freshmen are taking remedial math classes when they get there because their education has not prepared them for the college level mathematics, even though they met all the benchmarks, passed all the tests, and were in fact ready. So one of the solutions that some people have proposed to this dirty secret, which is what I was talking about in India, one of the solutions I'm very critical of is one developed by the Carnegie Federation of American Teachers called the Pathways Initiative, where they have new college classes called Quantway and Statway. The argument is not everybody needs to be a STEM student. Not everybody needs to be able to do pre-calculus or calculus. You know, we need to come up with math that those people can do. And I'm very much suspicious of these initiatives because it seems to me that all that's really being offered is a for-profit extension of the tracking and ability grouping that got us into this situation in the first place. By the time you get to the college freshman, the question becomes, well, how can we make sure that they keep coming back and paying for courses even if they're not earning credit for them? Is that really the question we should be asking? Or instead, should we be, along with Bob Moses, asking what kind of classes should students be taking as junior high and middle school students so that they have the conceptual framework necessary to understand what mathematics actually is? Finally, the last source I recommend to you is a radio interview from July 15th of 2020 with Bob Moses and Taylor Branch as part of a program called On Point by and the Boston Public Radio called America's Reckoning with Racism, the History Already Made in 2020. And you can hear what Moses has to say about the state of education today, what his thoughts are on whether or not the United States is at another moment in its history lurching and getting ready to make another big change or not. He's actually somewhat ambivalent about what the future direction of the country is going to be. But it is a very important interview. It's the interview where he makes the distinction between investing in assessment, which we've been doing a lot of, and investing in access and opportunity, which we have been doing less of. And that's my talk for today. Does anyone have any questions?
That was excellent. Thank you. Very interesting. I have questions. But before I should open it up to other people. Does anyone have any questions? Remember, we are being recorded. So you're free to ask the question vocally. If you don't feel comfortable asking, you can also type in and I'll read it. Any questions, anyone? Let me ask mine, and then maybe some more people might be typing. You mentioned the scenario where they AP brings a program to a classroom and the teacher says,
Right.
this is not, and
Right.
seems to reject it out of hand. Is there
Right.
any movement or any effort to teach in universities when we're training people to be teachers? So they're getting an education to train them there. So then when they're in school and they're teaching, if you come to them with this project, oh yeah, I know this, I'm familiar with this, or better yet, they just do it on their own. Is there any effort for that?
Well, there is certain effort in what I know is this. The Association for Philosophy of Mathematical Practice has been one of the first philosophy organizations that's reached out to professors of education to say, people who are professors of math education have things to tell us about mathematical practice. And so these exchanges have taken place, but it's still very informal. I don't know about what formal efforts there are to train future math educators in this algebra project approach to mathematical concepts. But it may be happening and I just don't know about it. It may be that there are specific universities that have incorporated that into their curriculum. But most of the work that is happening under the We the People banner is initiated by a confluence of people, community members, parents, students themselves. How do you get a 12-year-old to say, I want to take more math, please? Okay, cultivating demand is a big part of the issue here. And school administrators. And people in these different groups have different levels of commitment to the process, especially when they start out.
Yes, thank you. I do 3 questions popped up, so I'll read them.
Okay.
Here's the first one. Are there any studies that show how the algebra project's methods compare with traditional methods? Are they more effective? Do they work better with underprepared students?
There is some evidence that it is more effective, and the most significant thing in test scores that people observe when the algebra project strategies have been employed in middle school is that not only do students improve in their math scores, they improve in their verbal scores as well. And that was a surprise when people started comparing the data. The problem is that a lot of the data is presented on a school by school basis. So 5 years ago, this school only had 20% of the students who were ready for freshman math, and now they have 40%. And so it's very difficult, though, when you're working with schools to say, okay, we're going to take one school and divide the students up into random cohorts, right, because science, and then we're going to give Algebra Project protocol to these students and traditional methods to other students and then compare them at the end. It's almost as if an entire school has to make a commitment and then compare its new data against its old data in order to see the effectiveness of the project. But I think there's work to be done, frankly. There's just work to be done.
I could also imagine how there could be parents involved in that. And oh, no, not my student. My student will be the guinea pig here.
Well, one of the most interesting things about parents is when you ask them, do you think, this is, I'm going to just quote from Moses's book, when they ask the students questions, do you think your child should do algebra? And do you think every child should do algebra? Their responses taught me a lot about attitudes towards math. All parents thought their child should do algebra, but not all parents thought that every child should do algebra. So there's a part of the obstacle to programs and initiatives like this is the belief that some people just can't do math. And one of the things that Moses has done in his work to offset this is by talking about the bottom quartile. This is a problem with underrepresented minorities, but it's not exclusively a minority problem. It's also a poverty problem. And instead of saying this is something we need to do for members of this named community, Moses identifies the community we need to target as the bottom quartile. That is, that math tests are going to be given, and whenever you give a math test, you can rank how well people do on it, and there's always going to be 25% of the students at the bottom. Now, all the students could get better at mathematics, and there's still going to be 25% at the bottom. So by focusing on the lower quartile, the idea is that we're looking into an objective community of students who need help and intervention. I don't know if that answers that question or not.
Yeah, it does. That's interesting. Yeah, especially the part about my student deserves algebra, but not everyone.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, I got a couple other questions. Has Moses' approach found favor in other parts of the world?
That's a good question that I don't necessarily know the answer to. It would be interesting, there's a book out there that I didn't talk about. It's a 450-page biography of Robert Moses, written by a American civil rights scholar in the Netherlands, that ends when the man is 31 years old and heading to Canada and then Tanzania. We know that he is an international scholar who has worked in other parts of the world, but I can't say right now whether or not these methods have been adopted. One of the curious things that if I could ask Bob Moses one question, I have thought about what it would be, and I've narrowed it down to a few. But one of them is the statement that he makes in his book. He says, algebra is the gateway class in the United States, but in other countries, other classes may play the role of gatekeeper. For example, in France, they use geometry as a gatekeeper course. So what I would really like to do is follow up and find out, is there something in algebra itself that's universal and global that people struggle with, that we need these educational initiatives for, or is this a peculiarly American problem? I would like to know what his answer to that question is.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Here's another question. I think we got two more here. It starts with thanks, and then it says, I'm so sad that I did not know about this part of Moses' very important work. Can you explain to why this story isn't more well known? Is it racism, math hatred, both, something else?
I do think that racism is a big part of it, but math hatred is another part of it. Sometimes a lot of people in the social justice community are so excited that thanks to COVID, no one has to take the SATs or ACTs this fall, because it's as if the testing itself is creating these achievement gaps. And in a certain sense, it's true, because in order to measure a gap, you have a test, and the test says, look, here's the gap. But saying that the math test causes the achievement gap is kind of like saying COVID will go away if we do less testing, or we seem to have a lot of COVID cases because we're doing a lot of testing. I don't think the problem is with the testing. I think the gap is it's a result of so many factors. And so, like Sharon was talking about last week when she was talking about intersectionality and the importance of looking at the solution to problems of this nature as being multifaceted, I think that deep-seated suspicion that mathematics tests are part of the master's tools, that's part of the white people's business, and we don't want anything to do with it, does contribute to this dimension of Moses's career being less widely known than it could be. I do know that algebra elicits a lot of frustration on the part of people because they say that it isn't even math, right? A squared plus B squared, what is B? Well, I missed the day that we did the B times table, says a Scottish comedian. Um, but the problem is not that uh, it isn't math. The problem is that it's more math than is built into arithmetic. It's more fundamentally mathematical than merely arithmetic. And it's that hump that we have to get over. I'm reading Krista's. Oh, Dwight got kicked off. That's unfortunate. Hopefully he'll come back. I'm reading Christian's question. There's a lot to work to do to ensure that all students have access to algebra early enough. How do we make sure this happens? Well, we all have to demand it, okay? And cultivating demand is very difficult when you're talking about children's rights, because how do you cultivate demand in the population you're trying to serve when the population you want to target is children? How do you motivate children to take ownership of their own education? This is part of the biggest part of the challenge of the Algebra Project. And this is why a lot of meetings of people in the Algebra Project are designed to amplify student voices, okay? And that's why student initiatives to challenge states saying, I did not get my constitutionally guaranteed education from the state, I'm going to sue. That's new, and that might work. That's a strategy that might work. But I think in terms of grassroots and what all of us as individuals can do, maybe just think before you share that snarky meme about how hard or pointless or meaningless algebra is, and begin the process of understanding algebra as part of our cultural inheritance as human beings. Yes, we are literally trying to help 11, 12, 13-year-olds understand what Rene Descartes and Pierre Fermat struggled with in middle age 3 centuries ago. But we can do it. We can do it. I see we're running out of time. Has Dwight been able to rejoin us?
I am. I'm sorry I lost you there for a little while.
That's okay.
Thank you for carrying on, though. And you're right. I think we're out of time. Unfortunately, I lost comments too when everyone's chat.
I addressed one of them.
Okay, thank you.
You're
I think that
welcome.
was the last one. So I just want to say thank you very much. This was very informative.
You're welcome.
This was great for me. And thanks to everyone for attending as well. It's much appreciated. We're gonna continue. We'll have more. I'll send out announcements for more presentations. I think we have 2 next week, and we'll be in touch about those. Thank you very much, Dr. Muntersbjorn. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And bye, everybody.